We can see you move your mouse.
You can see a little dot, or you can see the mouse pointer?
We can see the mouse pointer.
Okay, cool. All right, that's good.
All right, feel free to get started.
Okay, hey, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. All right, so in this talk, we're going to talk about actually one of these strategies that Yaz mentioned in his talk, which he called defensive mining. And we're going to name that Reorg counterattacks. So this is a line of work we've been pursuing for a while with, I'm a PhD student at Harvard, working with David Parks. And this work was done in collaboration with the MIT Digital Currency Initiative. So that's headed by Neha, and two collaborators there, Dan Aronoff and James Lovejoy. Okay, and you can find me on Twitter or send me an email with any questions. Okay, so the fundamental question that a lot of us are asking here is, but maybe hasn't been like fully addressed, is what is actually the goal of proof of work systems? You know, going back to super fundamentals. And basically, we all want an append-only decentralized ledger that works. So when you submit a transaction onto the chain, you want to be sure that the transaction is going to stay on the chain. And you want to make sure, of course, that it's all valid. So no one's able to spend coins twice and so on. So the way that Satoshi solved this problem, you know, his point on proof of work security is that the system is secure as long as the attacker can't get a majority of the hash rate. And in that case, right, as mentioned before, we don't get perfect finality, but transactions are decreasingly likely to be reverted as you wait longer. So it's a probabilistic argument. So the goal that we're trying to achieve is an append-only decentralized ledger. And this goal is fundamentally threatened, it would appear, by hash rate marketplaces. So there's this question that arises, is proof of work as a system that enables an append-only decentralized ledger, does proof of work still work if you can rent an arbitrary amount of hash rate at any time? And so some recent theory, which assumes deep hash rate marketplaces, that is, you can rent a lot of hash rate, and a competitive miner economy, which means that basically anyone can get into the mining game, kind of like an open network like Bitcoin. So if you have those two assumptions, then this theory says that majority attacks, even without double spending, can be cheap. Meaning it can be in an attacker's interest to reorg the chain, even if there's no MEV or no double spend to do on it. It can be extremely cheap or even free. Why? Basically, because the attacker breaks even on the block rewards alone. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Basically, the amount that the attacker spends in order to attack the chain is exactly the amount that the attacker earns from the block rewards that they get from attacking the chain. So any MEV on top of that, or a double spend transaction on top of that, that's just a bonus. And one reason to think, kind of one anecdotal reason to think that mining is at least relatively competitive is that it's not super easy to make profits doing mining these days. Just a kind of throwaway quote is, you know, this, if you're not certain you can make profits from crypto mining, the answer is probably no. And so this raises, this is very concerning for proof of work, right? Because it says that once these markets get developed, and they're already developed to some extent, so for some chains this is already the case, proof of work is totally broken, as in anyone can attack it anytime, essentially for free. So that's a system where you look at the you basically look at one actor as possibly malicious, and every other actor as honest, right, following the protocol. And so under that model, you get this kind of scary result. But if you expand that model, and that's what we're going to talk about more in this work, if you expand that model to think about each actor as rational, then actually the threat of counterattack by the person being, by the entity being attacked provides a kind of deterrence, sort of analogous, I think, to the nuclear deterrence, that runs our nuclear policy, and especially during the Cold War. So basically, if you allow the theoretical possibility of a victim's counterattack, but you keep all the other same assumptions, that hash rate markets are deep and are open to everyone, and that you have a competitive miner economy, then you actually can get some pretty strong game theoretic results that the system is secure again. And we have some data evidence that this is in fact the case. Okay, so as an outline, we'll go very briefly over double spends, this theory of low-cost majority attack. We'll show how retaliation can make majority attack non-fatal, and we'll talk about some empirics. So double spend, we've talked about very quickly. This is just a graph that shows, okay, you have the main chain, the attacker sends the defender or victim a transaction on a public chain, but secretly is mining on their own longer chain, right? So that's this dashed line. The attacker is sending the transaction actually to themselves. Doesn't have to be the same address, just an address controlled by themselves, right? And then they continue this secret mining until it's longer than the main chain, and then they publish it. So the green shows what's public and what's heaviest. And in this way, the defender who thought that they had the transaction actually is stolen from. So this theory of low-cost majority attack is, I think, maybe started by Budish, but then it was expanded by Auer, and also there's some work by Hasu and actually Joe Bonneau from 2016 that kind of show similar results. So in this work, in this line of work, basically people say, okay, what are the assumptions? How does proof of work mining work? Well, anyone can join, anyone can become a miner, right? So there's miner free entry. And whenever there's miner free entry, eventually there should be zero profits, right? Because if people are making profits, then more people will enter, until those profits are reduced. But if people are losing money, then if miners are losing money, then miners will exit until the profits are again go to zero. And the second assumption is that an attacker has access to a hash rate market, which is liquid, which means that they can actually rent hash rate at the market rate and kind of as much as they want. So this is obviously not always fully true, but for smaller proof of work coins, for kind of lower hash rate coins like Ethereum Classic and Bitcoin Gold and stuff like this, where we've seen double spend attacks, that is definitely true. The hash rate markets are pretty liquid, and meaning that renting large amounts of hash rate doesn't actually impact the price that much. And so the result that this line of work gets is that attacks are cheap, and maybe even free, actually. So kind of if there's no frictions at all, if you can rent infinite amount, at exactly the market rate, then in principle, since miners are making zero profits, the amount that it takes to mine 10 coins is exactly the amount that you earn from the block rewards of those 10 blocks. So if you're an attacker and you remine, you go back in time and you remine 100 blocks, you're actually fully compensated for that mining power by the block rewards of those 100 blocks. So you get an attack for free, and in principle, anyone could be attacking the chains at any time for free. Okay, so that's under this theory of kind of one rational actor or one person who's trying to mess things up, and everyone else is following protocol honestly. And this also doesn't fully match with reality. Like, we see some double spend attacks, we see some reorg attacks, but we do not see reorg attacks every second of every day, which is what we might imagine if they were truly free. Okay, so let's talk about retaliation. And in fact, when a double spend attack happens, the defender, as was discussed by Yaz, in defensive mining, the defender can get hash rate too. And so under this kind of simple model, imagine that so we have the victim starts out with a transaction worth 100, right? And suppose the attacker spends the equivalent of 10 attacking the chain. So suppose it's not in fact free to attack the chain, but it costs a little bit. It costs 10 to attack the chain. So the attacker, if you only think about the first step of the game, the attacker is incentivized to do the attack because it costs 10 to do the attack, and they'll earn 100 from the MEV or from the double spend. And so it seems like the attacker would strictly choose to do this. But in fact, the victim could actually do the same thing, rent 10 units worth of hash power, and just extend their chain. And they actually have an advantage because kind of the chain that they're mining on has already been partially mined. So they just have to extend it to be slightly longer than the previous one, than the attacker's chain. So, and in this case, the attacker is actually out the 10 units that it spent attacking the chain, and it didn't, in fact, get the transaction in the end. So the assumptions in this model are basically that we have attackers and victims have equal access to hash power and are able to quickly respond, which in practice probably means that you'll need to do this in software. That kind of a defender who's typically an exchange would need to be monitoring chains and have kind of hash rate at the ready to counterattack if needed. And another assumption in this model, which is needed for this kind of, in order for the game not to go on infinitely, we have some kind of, we have some tie-breaking, minor requirements, which don't really speak to the core, idea of the game, but are required for the formal result. So basically, one of these is that the net profit of the attack decreases with every attack. So, in one way that this could be true in a number of ways, but basically, one assumption that a lot of people have made is that when all these attacks are happening, and it becomes known that these attacks are happening, probably the price of the asset on the chain decreases over time. And probably the more attacks happen, the more it decreases. So if you have that assumption, then you do get this, that the net profit of an attack decreases with each attack. And finally, we have this other tie-breaking point, which is that a defender has at least epsilon higher penalty to losing than the attacker. And one way to explain this is that typically the people who are being stolen from are reputable exchanges. And all this is public, right? So people can see that reorgs are going on. So the defender is typically someone like an exchange. That's typically who is stolen from. And the attackers are typically anonymous, right? Because it's, because they're stealing, it's probably illegal what they're doing. They're using, as we discussed, kind of various, they're sending their transactions to various, off US exchanges so they can't be tracked and so on. So it's not like they want to publicize who they are. So there's a reputational aspect to the defense, but not the attack, at least for now. So basically, in the game that we saw above, if the attacker wins, then the victim in our model suffers this extra penalty minus R, which is like a reputational, blip. And so we formalize this in this extensive form game. And I'll just go over quickly without being too formal. So, okay, so the way you can read this graph is that the attacker is the first to move. They are the ones who decide whether to actually start the game or not. That is, to do the first double spend attack or not, first reorg or not. So that's the two actions are fight or quit. So if they quit, then kind of nothing changes. The attacker gets 0. That's what this means. And the defender victim gets their full transaction value V. But if they choose to do the attack, now the defender has a choice, which is themselves to counter reorg or to just accept the reorg as it is. So if they accept the reorg, that's a quit. and then basically they lose. The defender will have payoff minus R. That's their reputation, being dinged in the public, and the attacker will get this. The attacker's reward will be this 5-1 V minus C, where 5-1 times V means that we've seen one reorg so far, and so we're discounting the value of the tokens that are stolen by that amount, kind of however much one reorg hurts the price, minus C, which is the actual cost of doing the attack, right? Which we discussed could be 0 in the kind of perfect frictionless world, but in the real world is non-zero, so C. And so this can go back and forth. So the defender could fight, and then we have this value discounted by 2, and so on. So basically, if we consider this model, in this model, we get this deterrence equilibrium, no attack equilibrium, and it's a pretty strong result. It's a subgame perfect equilibrium where the victim's ability to counterattack discourages an attack from double spending or reorging in the first place. And the intuition of this result is that both the attacker and the victim have some holdout time, as that is basically the number of reorgs beyond which the cost of attack is higher than the best possible reward. So they're fighting over this V, right? But the V is decreasing in value with every reorg. And so there's this number of reorgs beyond which it's not even worth doing the attack. And so basically, if both parties, if the attacker knows that the victim's holdout time is longer than the attacker's, then both would expect that the victim would fight for longer, would do more reorgs than the attacker, and so the victim would actually win, though at cost, right? A Pyrrhic victory. So knowing this, the attacker should not start the fight because they'll end up in the red. So now let's look at some empirical results. So this is joint work with James Lovejoy at the GCI, and so we compiled this. So he had built this reorg tracker for Bitcoin style chains, and so we tracked them for a couple of years. We tracked all these a number of I think 20 proof of work chains for about a year and a half, and we got. So some of these reorgs, like Ethereum Classic and Bitcoin Gold, in 2019 were public kind of before, but we were also able to see, possibly we were the only ones to report on a couple of these Bitcoin Gold attacks. And so a super interesting kind of evidence that NiceHash has a role to play here is that, kind of as Yaz mentioned also, there is price impact when these attacks are happening in some cases. So in the case of this Vertcoin attack, there actually was this great spike, by a factor of 2 or whatever, 3, in the price of the NiceHash Vertcoin kind of proof of work rental rate, but not always. So during the attacks on Bitcoin Gold, the price did not have a clear correlation to the attacks. And a super cool thing that we were able to observe, which validates, at least in part, our theory, we think, is that we were able to see this kind of interaction between attacker and counterattacker live on Bitcoin Gold in 2020. So we basically saw this double spend happen, and then the attacker, the value of the transaction was about 50K, and we estimated the cost to double spend once was about 1 to 2K. And so we actually saw the attacker and defender. So the attacker did a double spend. So first published a transaction, and then did a reorg in which that transaction was redirected to a different address, which overtook that chain. And then the original chain was extended. So that's the defender counterattacking. And then the attacker counterattacked. The attacker counterattacked, and then the defender finally counterattacked, or the correct number of counters. And so the defender actually won out that interaction, which in part validates our theory that actually the attackers have more at stake, and so should be more willing to defend their transactions than attackers, certainly for the long-term reputational aspect. Okay, so in summary, a simple theory shows that it could be cheap to attack some chains because rewards, the block rewards that you get for doing the attack actually pay for the mining cost. So we agree, and we've seen some of these attacks, but we show a game theoretic model in which double spending may not occur in equilibrium even if an attack is cheap. And there is practical evidence that attacks, even when they happen, can lose. So some discussion points. I kind of simplified the slides, but there's this factor of market impact in our full paper model, which you can check out. And the market impact, we think, is high for Bitcoin and Ethereum, protecting them from double spends, meaning that you can't actually rent that much Bitcoin or Ethereum hash rate relative to the full amount. But we do think the market for hash rate futures and derivatives is growing as a mechanism for large miners to de-risk. And so as the NiceHash and similar platforms get more robust, the problems that now are facing Bitcoin Gold and Ethereum Classic will potentially face, Ethereum and Bitcoin may eventually face the same issues. There's a couple other points that actually external trust enables parties to make large transactions without the risk of double spending, right? So if you have some other source of trust, then you don't need to worry about it, like KYC or whatever, the legal system. And also multiple victims also throws a wrench into this theory. So basically, if one attacker double spends two victims simultaneously, then they would have to coordinate and pool their resources in order to fight back efficiently against the attacker. And we think actually that is possible, just as the initial counterattacking software is, tricky but possible to do. So so in future work is can we carry a similar insight to other blockchain attacks, right? So basically, the basic insight is that it's not just one actor that is rational, and you get significantly different results when you think of one actor for rational versus all the actors rational. So it's possible that in selfish mining, multiple attackers may nullify the threat of a single selfish miner, which I think there's been some results on that. Mike also presented. So Mike is in our group at Harvard, and he presented some results kind of connected to that. And similarly, the MEV, the rise of MEV is this larger pool of possible attacks compared to just double spend attacks, right? And so as we've seen this threat of reorg kind of popularized on Twitter, and there's been like lots of hype and stress about it. But have people, could we build automated counterattacking software that nullifies that threat? I think that's definitely a possibility, and I welcome your thoughts on it. So please feel free to message me anytime to discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. This was really great. We're going to transition to our next talk now.
Sounds good.
Thanks again.